In 1998, he established and remains the director of the Emory Institute for the Study of Israel. And he is also, he has established and remains president of the Center for Israel Education, whose objective is to increase an understanding of Israel to learners of all ages through curriculum writing, podcast teacher workshops, long-distance learning, etc. Professor Stein will address us today on the intellectual and political assault on Israel. It is our privilege to have him here with us today. Professor Stein.
Don't speak into the light, speak into the microphone. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Bill and Jan and their staff for making it possible for me to come up from Atlanta. To Dan, we usually say an old friend, but I think it's far better to say a longtime friend, because we both are older and less endowed with hair between our ears. A particular thank you to Bill Hess, because not only is he a friend, but indirectly through a labyrinth of connections, we are also distantly related. But please don't hold that against me. I see in the audience former friends or present friends. I see former students and, of course, longtime colleagues. My task is not an easy one, because I have to do this in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, and there's just so much to talk about and so little time to do it in. I want to start on the positive side of the ledger rather than spending 20 minutes talking about the negative part, because there's plenty to talk about, but I'd like to talk about the positive part of the ledger first. We, as Jews, are still a minority. That hasn't changed in a very long period of time, regardless of where we live. And that is not going to change. Our status as a minority will continue to exist in this country. The only place it doesn't exist where we're a minority is, of course, in the state of Israel. The second point that's relevant, and it's relevant to know that we're a minority, because as a consequence, we have to appreciate and acknowledge that we will be treated as a minority for a long period of time, and we have to find ways to influence the majority about who we are and what we stand for. So it's a long-term task. It's a task that started after the expulsion in 70 AD, and it's continued right down to the present. We have to lobby, we have to speak up, we have to speak out, we have to find the mechanisms, lick the stamps to make it happen. If that means getting on a blog, that's what we have to do. The second reality is that we have the ability to speak out. We have the chance, the opportunity, the mechanisms, the intellect, the vehicles, the platforms to do so. 130 years ago, 88% of world Jewry lived in Western or Eastern Europe in the 1880s. And there was about 12 million Jews. Today there are about 13 million Jews in the world, but 84% of us or 85% of us live either in the United States or in Israel. And we live in places where we can determine our own future. We can influence our own future. We can do it by having a state that has a strong economy, by having a state that is militarily strong. We can do it in this country by participating in the political process. Our only enemy is our own ineptitude, our own apathy, our own unwillingness to step forward, and our own unwillingness to speak up and speak out. No one is telling us we can't. No one is restricting us from doing so. And if we don't speak up and we don't speak out and we don't react and we don't rebut, then the burden of responsibility is on our shoulders. We can't claim that the Nazis didn't provide us the, gave us the chance. We can't say we lived in the ghetto in the 14th century, what was formerly Italy. We can't say that we were denied the opportunity. So the burden of responsibility is here. It's all organizations that Dan Mariaschin mentioned, but it's on everyone's shoulders. And unless we do it, and I don't mean just talking about it, unless we do it, unless we educate our own, unless we move forward, unless we give our own the historical perspective that is necessary, then we're the ones who have lost to delegitimization. We're the ones that we lost to boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And no one can point a finger at anyone else except ourselves. And so the charge to all of you, before I even make my case, is we have to do, and we have to do it now. Waiting any longer is a mistake. Bill, I need to have a word of advice. What are the rules of engagement in reporting this event? Is this open to the general public? The press has free rein to do what they want, say whatever they want, write whatever they want. So anything here can be put on Twitter, put on Facebook. This is all open, general, right? Okay, fine. So if I have something to say which I'd like to leave off the record, I hope you will honor that request. My experience and my understanding of the topic of the intellectual and political assault comes from 35 years of teaching at Emory University, comes from my experience in the classroom with over 5,500 students, comes from writing in the academic realm and knowing about the Middle Eastern Studies profession in the United States, having been educated at the University of Michigan, 2 years at the Hebrew University, knowing a little bit about how the Israeli academic system works and operates in Middle Eastern and Israeli studies and Zionist studies. The experience also comes from being a researcher, from writing syllabi. It also comes from a unique opportunity I had from 1981 through 1993 in an active fashion to be an advisor to a former president, to meet and understand Middle Eastern leaders on a one-to-one basis, to work with him and understand his prejudices as well as his likes and dislikes. And so I come to this with a variety of different backgrounds. And the last is I've been very fortunate to have gone around the country for the last 25 or 30 years speaking to many Jewish organizations, scholar-in-residence programs, national meetings of Jewish organizations, and listening to what people say. And so I'm gleaning it not as someone who spent his life living in the Washington-Boston corridor. I have not done that. I've spent my time living in Atlanta as a transplant from Long Island. And believe me, I'm reminded quite frequently that I am a transplant. I once asked my former mother-in-law who lived in New Orleans, she once asked me, just before I got married in 1969, she said to me, "Would you like some grits?" And I said, "Yes, I'll try one." So I've come a long way as well. The delegitimization of the State of Israel is not something that comes out of the last two intifadas. It's not something that comes out of the Zionism, Racism Resolution of 1975. And it comes out of a history that can best be defined as one that does not find Israel palatable. There was in the 1940s, an effort made by the Jewish Agency to go to San Francisco and avoid having the UN take the issue of Palestine and turn it into a trusteeship. The folks who worked for the Jewish Agency at the time, David Hurwitz and Eliyahu Epstein, Eilat, and others, wanted to persuade all those who were at the UN in its formative years in March, April of 1945, to keep the trusteeship from coming into being because of, obviously, the Zionists wanted to create a state. They didn't want a perpetuation or continuation or a reformulation of the British mandate for Palestine, the trusteeship. And in that process, the Zionists made a great effort to talk to a lot of Arab leaders. And there's a wonderful book by David Horowitz called State in the Making, in which he has he quotes a meeting between a fellow by the name of Abba Eban, and Azam Pasha, who was the Secretary General of the Arab League. And Eban says the following. He says, our plan, our Zionist plan, is an arrangement with the Arab League based on a system of well-defined rights and obligations. Security we'll have for both of us. Your groundless suspicions of our alleged expansionist ambitions is not true. We want to ingather thousands of Jews. We're ready to give you concrete guarantees from ourselves and from the United Nations. Finally, the plan we have is an economic one in which we will consult with you, we'll work with you, we'll be involved in joint development with you. And Azam Pasha's response is the following, and I say this to you, and I quote this from you, because I want you to understand, I want you to please accept the reality that the historical context of delegitimization has its roots when the Arab League rejected the very idea of what Eban and Horowitz were suggesting as it came down from Sharet and Ben-Gurion. This is what Azam Pasha said. The Arab world is not in a compromising mood. It's liking Mr. Horowitz that your plan is rational and logical, but the fate of nations is not decided by rational logic. Nations never concede, they fight. You won't get anything by peaceful means or compromise. You can perhaps get something, but only by the force of arms. We shall try to defeat you. I'm not sure we'll succeed, but we'll try. We were able to drive out the Crusaders, but on the other hand, we lost Spain and Persia. It may be that we shall lose Palestine, but it's too late to talk of peaceful solutions. An agreement will only be acceptable at our terms. The Arab world regards you as invaders and as ready to fight you. The conflict of interest among nations is, for the most part, not amenable to any settlement except armed clash. It is in the nature of peoples to aspire to expansion and fight for what they think is vital. It is possible I don't represent, in the full sense of the word, the new spirit which animates my people. Then he finished by saying, the forces which motivate peoples are not subject to our control. They're objective forces. It may have been possible in the past to have reached agreement if the amalgamation from below, but it's no longer feasible. You speak of the Middle East. We don't recognize that conception. We only think in terms of the Arab world and Arab nationalism. Now, that's 1945. Now, you can close your eyes, and I can show you any publication from a Hamas publication or from an Ahmadinejad publication of a day ago, a week ago, a month ago. The point of it is that Israel is not loved, the Jewish state is not loved, Zionism is not loved, and it's not something that just happened because of the failure of the peace process or because of settlements. It happened because there's unacceptability of a Jewish state in the modern Middle East. Now, that has slightly changed with the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel and the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. And that shift has come. Now we're questioning, will that shift remain one that pushes toward an accommodation between Israel and its Arab neighbors, or will it not? And the logic of my remarks stems from a realization that since 1967, particularly, Israel has shifted from being the David to the Goliath. And Israel is portrayed as the Goliath in many formats and in many ways. We've become that because we as American Jews or American Gentiles fell into the notion that a peace process meant acceptance. We fell into the notion that because Sadat went to Jerusalem and spoke under a picture of Theodor Herzl, that somehow the Jewish state was accepted, that somehow the lion would lay down in the valley or in the pasture with the lamb. There, of course, is the great story of Henry Kissinger driving through West Jerusalem on his way to Mount Scopus while he was doing the shuttle diplomacy. And as he passed the Jerusalem Zoo, about every 2 or 3 hours, he noticed that there was a lion and a lamb lying in the valley or lying in the pasture. And he finally turned to his Israeli escort officer and he said, I don't understand. How do you do that? And the Israeli escort officer said, we put a new lamb in every half hour. And the lesson there is Israel doesn't want to be the lamb. That's the lesson. That's the key of the story. Sadat made it kosher for Americans to embrace an Arab leader. Israel's presence in the territories after the 1967 war became an object of dissension between the United States and Israel. Yitzhak Rabin embraced the idea of recognizing the PLO, not because he loved Arafat. He didn't love that handshake on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993. He did it because he thought it was a good gamble for Israel to try and work with a secular element of the Palestinian Arab national movement rather than have to worry about this newly formed Hamas movement, which had been developing after the 1967 war, but really catalyzed itself at the end of the 1980s. Now, everyone puts the responsibility for the death or the dying or the atrophying of the negotiating process on Rabin's death, as if Rabin could have done it by himself. It always takes two to sign an agreement. But the myth we had in America, mostly as American Jews, in American organizations, Jewish organizations, was these treaties, this diplomacy will work. And we focused on the diplomats, we focused on Washington, we focused on congressmen and senators and every 2 and 4 year elections and presidents and what was their attitude. What we weren't watching was the nefarious, insidious, intellectual insurgencies that were beginning to evolve on the ground that began in seriousness in the middle of the 1980s. It began with first Edward Said's publication of Orientalism, and then it blossomed through the Middle Eastern Studies departments of American campuses, and then there was the new Israeli historians in Israel who adopted the notion that Israel was responsible for original sin, for pushing the Palestinians off, and then it moved out of Israel in 1947, 48, and 49, and then it continued into the 1990s. Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel. Arafat accepted Oslo. And Arafat himself was capable of keeping within his body and his mind and his heart, on the one hand, the Kalashnikov, and on the other hand, the ideas of negotiation. And he kept that going and kept fueling the notion that an accommodation could be made. And the dream of American Jews and the dream of Israelis and the dream of many Jews or Gentiles throughout the world supported the state of Israel is, we'll get the diplomatic thing going. And we didn't focus on what was going on in universities, what was going on in the intellectual world, and we weren't training our own kids about our own history. How many can put their hand up and said, I had a great congregational school experience in being prepared for my bar or bat mitzvah? I dare 10% of this audience to say so, and then go to Yom Kippur and not repent. I dare you. And what we did not do is we did not prepare the next generation to confront the Jimmy Carters or the Walton Mearsheimers. I'm not talking about what happens on university campuses. I'm talking in environments where we influence what our kids learn and how they learn it. We thought if we took the SUV and dropped it off at the door, dropped the kids off at the door at 3:30 or 5:30 on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Sundays, that would be sufficient. We thought that if we invited someone to speak at a national Jewish organization and spoke about the Matzav, that would be sufficient. But we didn't. It's not Jewish day schools, and it's not camps. Melton, Wexner, Israel On Campus Coalition, dozens of other organizations have done lots of good work, but it's all been catch-up because of what we didn't do starting back in the 1950s. So we have to change the paradigm. If we want people to lick stamps, if we want to make a difference, if we want people to understand BDS and Durban and all of these other topics and issues, we have to train our kids. And I'm not talking about advocacy here. I'm talking about our students want to know why. They don't want to be told what to say. They want to be told why they need to say it. And I'm not arguing against the David Project, and I'm not arguing about Stand With Us. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. They all have a role. But we have a much more fundamental need to change in North American Jewry over the next 25 to 50 years if we're going to make a systematic and systemic difference. That's my appeal. What happened on university campuses happens because the universities in general, the social science faculty, the humanities faculty, by their own self-definition, by a variety of surveys, have indicated that they have attitudes that are left of center. And when I go into the classroom and I ask my students to buy certain books for on the syllabus, and I assign certain readings, I have the sole prerogative to determine what that student does and reads and what his requirements are for the conclusion of the course. No dean, no provost, no one else has any say about what I do. Now, this is very different than the real world, because if you don't produce at a law firm or a business firm, or in your own business, your own entrepreneurial choice, if you fail, you fail. No one bails you out. No one can tell you it's okay for you to continue to do what you're doing. I can't change what goes on in Middle Eastern studies departments. I can't stop money coming in from the outside. I have no influence over that. I can be angry. I can say it's not fair. But there's only one place where I can have some influence, and that's upon young Jewish kids who may tomorrow be the ones who become the congressmen and the senators and the people who represent Israeli interests in the United States in a wide variety of the public fora. A professor at the University of South Carolina in 2002, in the 9th week of his class, handed out a study sheet to 130, 140 freshmen, sophomores, and juniors that said 9/11 occurred because of America's relationship with the State of Israel. Had the United States not been cultivating a strong relationship with the State of Israel, it's highly likely the United States would not have been attacked. Now, what does a student do? Calls his mother, calls the local ADL office, gets in touch with someone at the American Jewish Committee. What happens if the kid has to go to the midterm and leaves out on the midterm that 9/11 occurred and didn't say that it occurred because of America's relationship with the State of Israel, and the kid loses 4 points? Oh, yeah, it happens. So some kid has to be smart enough to know that this is an erroneous assertion made by a professor, and you have to speak up and you have to speak out. And you have to go with a colleague and you have to go sit in the professor's office and you say, that's a very interesting assumption. I disagree with it. Can you show me the substance? Can you show me the evidence? And he said, no, that's my opinion. And then you go to the chairman of the department and you say, look, I know we're going to have a midterm in 2 weeks. I don't want to be penalized 4 points or whatever it's going to be in the midterm because I disagree with the professor. I resigned from the Carter Center in 2006, not because I did not like the title of the book, though I found it offensive, but that was not sufficient reason to resign. I resigned from the Carter Center because Jimmy Carter invented information, exactly as Dan Mariashin referred to earlier. They're myths. There's no pushback. Who holds a former president accountable? We wrote a book together in the 1980s. I drafted about 70% of it. He virtually completely revised certain portions of it. And one point in the book, he wanted to describe Menachem Begin as a fierce Israeli nationalist who only believed in Israel's borders as those that included all the land west of the Jordan River and east of the Jordan River. And I said, Mr. President, you can't do that. That's not Menachem Begin today. That may have been Menachem Begin in the Irgun in the 1940s, but it doesn't work today. That's not correct. He said, I'm going to leave it. And we had one more argument about it, and finally he looked at me at the Carter Center, and I said, Mr. President, please change it. He said, Ken, the subject is finished, it's over. Remember, only one of us was president of the United States. Yeah, that's true. You know, I did not beat Gerald Ford in the 1976 elections, although Gerald Ford was a graduate from the University of Michigan and played Michigan football, and I was very much a lover of Gerald Ford, even if he only played in the 1930s. I resigned from the Carter Center because Carter tried to change the terms of reference on the core document that is used in Arab-Israeli negotiations. He tried to change UN Resolution 242. Now, 4 times in his book, not once, not twice, not 3 times, he writes in his book that 242 requires, mandates Israeli withdrawal from the territories taken in '67, and Menachem Begin agreed to that at Camp David. Now, not the Menachem Begin I know, nor the Menachem Begin that 99.9% of people in this room know, would he have agreed that he's going to withdraw from Judea and Samaria. But he writes it in the book. So after I saw it, I said, he knows better. But he did it intentionally in order to put the burden of responsibility and accountability on Israelis' shoulders. That's the assault on Israel. It's invention of information and data points. And now Carter's book is used as a source in X number of courses in North America that deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not that Carter's book is dangerous. Carter's book is dangerous for the historiography of the conflict in terms of how it's going to be taught in 5 and 10 and 15 and 25 years. That's the issue. There have to be more than half a dozen Ken Steins in the United States who are willing to speak up and speak out. Why wasn't it? Why didn't more people step forward? Maybe they didn't know the detail. Maybe they didn't want to get engaged in it. I didn't have to worry about it. My salary was coming from Emory University. I was a full tenured professor. It didn't matter if I pissed him off. Besides which, my relationship with him for the previous years, I worked my tail off trying to serve him and make him as smart as I possibly could on Middle Eastern issues, and he knew it. And no doubt he knew it, as did Mrs. Carter know it. And my memoranda to him in the early 1980s about some of the one-sided things he was saying in public, I really broadsided him in some of the memos that I wrote to him, including some that came back to me in 1985. He said, you could use a tone of moderation if you're criticizing me and the fact that I'm being one-sided in the Arab-Israeli conflict in its analysis. We got into this dilemma, we got into this slippery slope because we weren't watching, we weren't teaching, we weren't imparting, we weren't making our kids know, own, and belong to our story. We didn't insist that our story, American Jewish history, European Jewish history, and Israeli history, be known to us like we know the 4 questions. The whole notion of Zionism was that Jews should take control of their own destiny. They should shape their own future. They should not be the object in someone else's sentence, but they should be the subject of their own. And the nefarious activity of demonization and delegitimization is an effort to deny Jews the right to speak up and speak out for themselves. It's very insidious. It is an intellectual insurgency. We've become accustomed, regrettably, to listening people talk about the narrative rather than the history. Mahmoud Abbas did a first-rate job about speaking about the Palestinian narrative at the UN. But he didn't talk much about the history of what happened. He mentioned the Nakba 4 times. The words settlement and occupation were probably mentioned at least 15 to 18 times. He spoke eloquently in using all the necessary terms that relate to the delegitimization of Israel. Entrenched occupation, ethnic cleansing, racial discrimination, war of aggression, systemic confiscation, brutality of aggression, crimes of the settlers, colonial settlement occupation, unilateral actions, uprooting destruction, historical injustice, apartheid policies, racist annexation. It's as if someone went through and culled all the key phrases that have been used over the last 35 years, and he managed to get them all into his 35-minute speech. Very well crafted. a nonsense. He didn't mention the word Jews. He also didn't mention the word Hamas. He didn't mention the Egyptian-Israeli treaty. He didn't mention the Jordanian-Israeli treaty. And he said nothing about American mediation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Only spoke about what happened in the last year and what didn't occur as a result of the meetings. Enough, no door unlocked, I think he said. So what is the purpose of going to the international community? What is the purpose of going to the UN? A major purpose of going to the UN is circumvent the United States as an intermediary, as a mediator. It's to limit American engagement in Arab-Israeli negotiations. It's get away from UN Resolution 242 and 338. He didn't mention them. He spoke about 194, refugees. Abbas's speech was a classic example of delegitimization of the State of Israel. In a public forum meant to embrace the Palestinian right for statehood. I believe in the two-state solution. Always have. I'm a historian. I believe in the 37 partition, the 47 partition. I believe in the Oslo Accords. I believe the only way to Israel is ever going to exist if it gets out of the affairs of the Palestinians and the Palestinians get out of the affairs of the Israelis. And I believe in Israel as a Jewish state. There's very little I disagree with when it comes to Bibi Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech of June 2009. It's reasonable. So while you have a public that's embracing him, at the same time his content where he said, I want to establish the terms of reference for negotiations, he laid down his own terms. He said, Israel won't accept the terms of reference. Well, his terms of reference are Resolution 194. That's not what the purpose of the State of Israel was. And you're talking like that. But they always have. Or most of the time they have. So gird yourself for the reality that demonization and delegitimization is not going to stop. Accept the notion that you have to become more prepared and more engaged and more participatory in all the fora that are necessary for you to do that. And don't run from the responsibility. And certainly don't run from the responsibility of teaching it diligently unto our children. We say that in the V'ahavta. We have to admire it, and we have to follow it. Thank you very much.